The fluorescent lights flickered slightly as the early morning crew trickled into Lancaster Grand Hotel, an upscale five-star establishment in the heart of the city. The lobby, adorned with gold-accented chandeliers and pristine marble floors, exuded luxury. But behind the polished facade, trouble brewed. "Oh, for heaven's sake, can you move any slower?" barked Ethan Carter, the hotel's young, arrogant manager, as he glared at the elderly janitor struggling to mop a corner of the lobby. Frank Dawson, a frail man in his 70s, wiped his brow, gripping the mop with wrinkled hands. "I'm almost done, sir," Frank said politely, though there was a hint of exhaustion in his voice. Ethan scoffed. "Almost done? You've been at it for 20 minutes. Do you have arthritis or something?" Several employees nearby exchanged nervous glances. Emily Thompson, the hotel's kind-hearted receptionist, clenched her fists. She had worked under Ethan long enough to know he had zero respect for the staff, especially those beneath him. Frank lowered his gaze and kept scrubbing, determined to finish. He had been working at Lancaster Grand for just a week, but already he had seen how Ethan treated the employees, like disposable trash. "You better pick up the pace, old man," Ethan sneered. "I won't have some useless geezer slowing things down in my hotel." The next morning, Ethan arrived at the restaurant, completely oblivious to what had transpired the night before. He walked in, expecting to resume his usual reign of terror, but instead he was met with silence. The staff, those he had belittled for years, stood together, their faces unreadable. Frank Dawson sat at a booth near the entrance, sipping his morning coffee. His expression was calm, but his presence alone sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "Good morning, Ethan," Frank greeted, his voice steady. Ethan frowned. "What are you doing here?" Frank set his coffee down. "We need to talk." A pit formed in Ethan's stomach. Something felt off. He glanced around, noticing how everyone was looking at him differently. There was no fear in their eyes, only quiet confidence. "What's this about?" Ethan scoffed, crossing his arms. Frank stood up, his presence towering over Ethan. "It's about the way you've treated my staff, the way you've disrespected this business, my business." Ethan's eyes widened. "What do you mean, your business?" Frank pulled out a set of documents from his jacket pocket and placed them on the table. "I am Frank Dawson, the founder and owner of this restaurant, and as of today, you're no longer the manager." Ethan's face turned pale. What?" He grabbed the papers, scanning them in disbelief. It was all there, legal proof of Frank's ownership. The finality of it hit Ethan like a brick wall. His reign was over. "This isn't fair," Ethan barked, slamming the papers down. "You can't just fire me." Frank's gaze hardened. "I'm not just firing you, Ethan. I'm giving you a choice." Ethan's breath hitched. "A choice?" Frank nodded. "You can walk out that door, and I'll make sure your actions follow you to every future job you apply for." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "Or you can stay, but not as a manager." Ethan's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Frank folded his arms. "You'll work as a janitor." The restaurant went silent. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "You're joking." "I'm not," Frank said firmly. "You'll clean the floors, scrub the toilets, and experience the very work you disrespected for so long." Ethan's face turned red. "You expect me to be a janitor? Me?" Frank leaned in slightly. "You seem to think being a janitor is beneath you, Ethan. Maybe it's time you learn what it really means to work hard." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. He looked around, hoping for someone, anyone, to back him up. But the staff stood in silent agreement. No one was on his side. He turned back to Frank. "And if I refuse?" Frank gestured to the door. "Then leave." Ethan's breath was shaky. His mind raced. Every ounce of his pride screamed at him to walk away. But the realization hit him. If he left, he had nothing. No job, no reputation, no future. His eyes flickered toward the janitorial closet. Could he really do it? Could he lower himself to that level? He swallowed hard, looking at Frank one last time. "I'll think about it," Ethan muttered before storming out of the restaurant. The moment he left, the employees erupted into applause. Linda wiped a tear from her eye. "I can't believe it. He's finally gone." Frank sighed, but there was no satisfaction in his face. He knew people like Ethan didn't change overnight. Still, he had given him a choice. Now it was up to Ethan to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. Ethan spent the next few days in a daze. He had never felt so humiliated in his life. His pride kept screaming at him to move on, find another job, and prove that he didn't need Frank or that stupid restaurant. But reality was cruel. Word of his firing spread fast. No restaurant in town wanted to hire a disgraced manager known for mistreating employees. Every interview ended the same way: rejection. For the first time in years, Ethan was powerless. One evening, as he sat in his tiny apartment, staring at a pile of unpaid bills, his phone vibrated. It was an email from Frank's assistant. Subject: last chance. Ethan, I assume you've had time to think. My offer still stands. Show up tomorrow at 6 a.m. if you want to work. Frank Dawson. Ethan stared at the screen, his jaw clenched. His pride told him to delete the email, but his empty fridge and overdue rent whispered a different story. With a deep breath, he made a decision. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the restaurant. The moment he stepped inside, every head turned. Employees whispered among themselves, barely hiding their amusement. Linda smirked. Well, look who's back. Ethan ignored the snickers and walked up to Frank, who was waiting near the janitorial closet. You're late, Frank said, checking his watch. Ethan bit back his anger. It's only 5 minutes. 5 minutes as a manager is different from 5 minutes as a janitor, Frank said. You don't set the rules anymore, Ethan. You follow them. Ethan exhaled sharply. Fine. What do you want me to do? Frank pointed to the mop and bucket. The floors aren't going to clean themselves. Ethan gritted his teeth, grabbed the mop, and started working. The first few days were unbearable. He mopped floors while employees, many of whom he had once belittled, watched in silent amusement. Every scrub, every sweep, every moment on his knees scrubbing gum from under tables burned his pride. But worst of all was Linda. She didn't mock him, but she didn't coddle him either. She simply treated him like any other employee. And somehow, that stung more than outright laughter. One evening, as Ethan cleaned a particularly stubborn stain near the entrance, Linda approached him. You missed a spot, she said, pointing to the corner. Ethan exhaled sharply. Yeah, I see it. She crossed her arms. You know, if you just admitted you needed this job, people would stop waiting for you to quit. Ethan scoffed. I don't need this job. Linda raised an eyebrow. Then why are you still here? Ethan opened his mouth to respond but hesitated. Why was he still here? Weeks passed and something changed. The humiliation faded. The employees stopped watching him with amusement. And slowly, almost unconsciously, Ethan began working with more effort. One evening, Frank found him wiping down tables, something not even on his list of duties. Didn't ask you to do that, Frank said. Ethan shrugged. Yeah, well, needed to be done. Frank nodded. Good. A pause. Then to Ethan's surprise, Frank smirked. I wasn't sure if you'd last a week. Ethan leaned against the mop handle. Neither did I. Frank's expression turned serious. You were a terrible manager, Ethan. Ethan flinched but said nothing. But, Frank continued, people can change. The question is, do you want to? Ethan swallowed hard. He thought about his past self, the arrogant, cruel man who treated people like dirt. Did he want to be that person again? For the first time, he wasn't so sure. Ethan spent weeks reflecting on Frank's words. The more he worked, the more he realized the impact his actions had on others. And it was a bitter pill to swallow. He had been given a second chance, a gift that many didn't get, and he couldn't waste it. One afternoon, as he was sweeping the kitchen floor, Linda stopped by. Ethan, can I talk to you for a second? She asked, her voice uncharacteristically soft. Ethan looked up, wiping the sweat from his brow. Sure, what's up? Do you ever miss being the manager? She asked, leaning against the counter. Ethan paused. The question hit him harder than he expected. At first, yeah, but now, I don't know. I guess I never really appreciated the work everyone else put in. I just told people what to do. Linda nodded as if she had been expecting this answer. I see. It's a tough pill to swallow, but a good one. You're not the same person you were when you first got here. Ethan shook his head. I don't think I even knew who I was back then. I think you're finding out now, she said with a slight smile. And it's a good thing. Ethan thought about her words as he finished his shift and headed home that night. He had made mistakes, huge ones, but he wasn't beyond redemption. And as long as he kept learning, kept improving, maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference. Months passed and the restaurant's atmosphere shifted. Ethan no longer felt like an outsider. He had earned the respect of his colleagues, not by his title or his position, but through hard work and genuine humility. He stopped seeing his role as a demotion and began to see it as an opportunity to grow, to learn from those around him, and to be a better person. One evening, as he was finishing his shift, Frank called him over. "You're doing good, Ethan," Frank said, his voice almost unrecognizable. There was no mockery, no sarcasm, just a quiet acknowledgement. "I see the difference." Ethan felt a rush of emotion at the words. "Thank you," he said, his voice tight. Frank gave a half smile. "Just keep it up. You've earned my respect." And for the first time in a long time, Ethan believed him. It wasn't long before Ethan received another unexpected offer, this time from Frank. One day, as Ethan arrived early for his shift, he was pulled aside by Frank and Linda. "Ethan," Frank said, his voice more serious than usual, "we've been talking, and I think you're ready for more responsibility." Ethan blinked in confusion. "More responsibility? I'm just here to clean." "We think it's time to give you a role as a supervisor," Linda added, her eyes gleaming with pride. "You've proven you can lead with respect and humility. We want to give you the chance to lead a team." Ethan stared at both of them, dumbfounded. "You're serious?" Frank nodded. "Absolutely." Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes. He had never thought he would be given a second chance, let alone this kind of responsibility. "I won't let you down," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't," Frank said with a firm smile. "You already haven't." As Ethan began his new role as a supervisor, things changed. He no longer relied on intimidation or authority to get things done. Instead, he led by example, working alongside his team, listening to their concerns, and offering support when needed. He knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, Ethan felt proud of the man he had become. As months passed, Ethan continued to rise within the company. His reputation as a compassionate leader grew, and soon enough, he was entrusted with larger responsibilities. But no matter how high he climbed, he never forgot where he came from, or the people who helped him get there. 1 year later, Ethan stood in front of the restaurant, the building he had once walked into with nothing but arrogance. Now, it was a place he called home. And as he walked in that morning, he was greeted by his team, the people who had once been his subordinates, now his colleagues and friends. The world had changed for Ethan, and so had he. He no longer wore the title of manager or supervisor with pride. Instead, he wore it with a quiet sense of responsibility. A responsibility to those who trusted him, a responsibility to lead with integrity, and a responsibility to be better every day. And as he walked to the front, he saw Frank and Linda standing side by side, watching him with approving smiles. "Good morning, Ethan," Frank said, his voice calm and steady. "Morning," Ethan replied, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thanks for believing in me." "Thanks for proving us right," Linda added with a wink. "You earned this." Ethan smiled, knowing this was just the beginning of his journey. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, he was ready. The restaurant was bustling with activity, but Ethan had never felt more at peace. His team was working smoothly, the air was filled with laughter and productivity, and the daily grind felt less like a chore and more like a mission. As he walked through the kitchen, overseeing the staff, he couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. It had been a year since he had been given the opportunity to make things right. A year since he was humiliated, degraded, and forced to confront his own flaws. He had learned the hard way, but it had all been worth it. The long hours of self-reflection, the awkward conversations with colleagues who had once feared him, the countless moments of doubt, every part of the journey had shaped him into the man he was today. He had become a leader not because of his title or his rank, but because he had earned the respect of his colleagues through hard work and sincerity. He had learned that leadership wasn't about asserting dominance or control. It was about empowering others to be the best versions of themselves, to work together toward a shared goal. It was about building trust, listening, and making people feel seen and valued. As he sat in his office that afternoon, reflecting on the past year, the door opened softly and Frank walked in, his expression unreadable. "Hey, Frank, what's up?" Ethan asked, leaning back in his chair. Frank closed the door behind him and took a seat across from Ethan. "I just wanted to check in," he said quietly. "How are you doing?" Ethan smiled, a bit surprised by the question. "I'm doing great, honestly. This place feels like home now. I'm really proud of what we built together." Frank nodded, his face softening with approval. "You should be. I've seen a huge change in you. You're leading with your heart now, not just your position. That's the difference between a boss and a true leader." Ethan felt a swell of emotion at Frank's words. The weight of his transformation hit him all at once. How far he had come, how much he had learned, how much more he had to offer. "I'm not perfect," Ethan said, his voice filled with humility. "But I'm trying." Frank smiled. "That's all anyone can ask for. And you've done more than try. You've succeeded. You've made a real impact here." Ethan's gaze shifted to the framed photo on the wall, his first day on the job. He remembered that day clearly. He had been full of arrogance and entitlement, thinking he was invincible. Now that Ethan seemed like a stranger. "You've earned your place here," Frank continued, his tone soft yet firm. "But don't forget what got you here. Your humility, your willingness to grow, and your ability to help others grow." "I won't forget," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. The months that followed were filled with even more challenges, higher stakes, more responsibility, and even more opportunities to prove himself. But Ethan no longer saw these as obstacles. He saw them as chances to continue proving that he was worthy of the trust others had placed in him. As the months turned to years, Ethan's reputation as a compassionate, hardworking leader spread beyond the restaurant. He was invited to speak at leadership conferences, and his story became one of inspiration for those who had been given second chances. The restaurant, once a place of tension and division, was now thriving. The staff worked together like a well-oiled machine, with Ethan at the helm, steering the ship with a calm, measured hand. He had earned the loyalty of his colleagues, and in turn, they had helped him grow into the leader he had always wanted to be. One evening, as Ethan was about to lock up, Frank stopped by his office again. This time he was carrying a small envelope. "Got something for you," Frank said, handing it over. Ethan looked up, surprised. He took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a letter. "Dear Ethan," the letter began, "it's rare that a person is able to turn their life around so completely, but you have. I've watched you grow, not just as a leader, but as a person. You've proven yourself time and again, and I'm proud to call you my colleague." Ethan's heart raced as he read the rest of the letter. It was from the board of directors, the ones who had been skeptical about his promotion in the past. But now they were offering him something bigger, a chance to take on an executive role and help shape the future of the company. "You're being considered for a higher position," Frank said, his voice serious but filled with admiration. "I think you're ready." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "Are you serious?" Frank nodded. "They believe in you, and I do too." At that moment, an older couple entered the lobby, impeccably dressed, clearly high-profile guests. Ethan's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. He straightened his tie, pasted on a fake smile, and rushed toward them. "Welcome to Lancaster Grand. It's an honor to have you," he said smoothly. Frank watched the hypocrisy unfold but said nothing. What Ethan didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Frank Dawson wasn't just some random janitor. He was the hotel's real owner, testing his staff in disguise, and Ethan had just made the biggest mistake of his career. As Ethan stood before the mirror that evening, getting ready for the big meeting, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led him to this moment. He had been given so many chances, and each one had been an opportunity to prove that he was more than the arrogant man he had once been. He wasn't perfect, but he had learned to embrace his flaws and grow from them. And now, standing on the precipice of something bigger, he knew one thing for certain. No matter where life took him, He would always remember the lessons that had gotten him here. Humility, hard work, and the ability to see the value in others. That was what mattered. As he walked into the boardroom, Ethan was no longer the same man who had once been blinded by pride. He was a leader, not because of his title or position, but because of the person he had become. The days following the board meeting were a whirlwind of emotions and decisions. Ethan had been offered the promotion, a prestigious role overseeing multiple restaurants and operations. It was an opportunity that would elevate him to a level he never thought possible. But despite the excitement and honor of it all, there was something that kept him grounded, a quiet, humbling realization. As he walked through the bustling restaurant that night, watching the kitchen staff working in perfect sync, he took a moment to pause and reflect. This wasn't just about climbing the corporate ladder. It wasn't about titles or prestige. It was about the journey he had taken to get here, the growth, the hard lessons, and the people who had shaped him into the man he was now. He thought back to his first days as a manager. He had been arrogant and dismissive, completely unaware of the weight that responsibility carried. He had thought he was invincible, that his status would somehow earn him respect. But it was through his failures and the people he had wronged that he learned the true meaning of leadership. The staff members who had once feared him now respected him, not because he was the boss, but because he had earned their trust. He had shown them time and time again that he was willing to listen, to learn, and to support them. He had learned the value of empathy, the importance of leading by example, and most of all, the power of humility. Frank had been right. His journey wasn't about achieving a position of power. It was about becoming someone others wanted to follow, someone they could trust to guide them, even in the most difficult times. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. It was Sam, one of his most trusted kitchen staff members. "Hey, Ethan," Sam said, his voice warm and sincere. "I heard the news. Big promotion, huh?" Ethan smiled. "Yeah, it's crazy. I didn't see this coming, honestly." Sam nodded as if he understood exactly what Ethan meant. "You've worked hard for it. We all see the way you've changed. It's not just about the job. It's about the way you've become a better leader, a better person. We all look up to you." The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. He had never sought validation from his team. In fact, for most of his career, he had believed he didn't need it. But now, standing there, hearing those words, he realized how much their respect meant to him. It was a respect he had earned, not by force or fear, but by genuinely caring for the people he worked with. "I appreciate that, Sam," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I really do." Sam clapped him on the back. "You deserve it, man. We're all rooting for you." As Sam walked away, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him. This was it. This was what he had worked for. Not just the promotion, but the respect, the friendships, and the growth. He had earned every ounce of it, not through his title, but through the way he had transformed himself from the inside out. Later that evening, as Ethan sat at his desk, going over the final details of his transition into the new role, he couldn't help but think about the past. The manager who had once been ruthless and entitled, the person who had thought success was measured by power and control. He was gone, replaced by someone who understood the true meaning of leadership. Ethan leaned back in his chair and sighed. There was still so much to learn, so much more to do. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid. He knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he was ready. He had the skills, the wisdom, and the heart to face whatever came next. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan settled into his new role. The responsibilities grew heavier, but so did the rewards. He had the power to shape the future of the company, but more importantly, he had the chance to make a real difference in the lives of the people who worked for him. The same people who had supported him when he was at his lowest, who had believed in him even when he couldn't believe in himself. The restaurant chain continued to thrive, and Ethan's leadership became a model for others in the industry. His story was shared at conferences, and young leaders looked up to him as an example of what true leadership could look like. But Ethan knew that none of it would have been possible without the people who had stood by him, who had helped him grow. And every time he stepped into the restaurant, every time he walked through the kitchen or sat down with his team, he was reminded of the most important lesson he had learned. Leadership isn't about power or control, it's about people. It's about caring for them, supporting them, and helping them achieve their best. It's about being humble enough to learn from your mistakes and strong enough to guide others through their own. As Ethan looked out the window of his office that night, watching the lights of the city twinkle in the distance, he smiled. He had come a long way, and while he had no idea what the future held, he knew one thing for sure: he was ready for it. As Ethan strutted off to charm the wealthy guests, Frank quietly resumed his work. His hands ached from years of hard labor, but he had never been one to complain. He had built this hotel from the ground up, brick by brick, dream by dream. But now, standing there in his janitor's uniform, he realized how little respect his employees truly had for those they considered beneath them. Frank had always believed in the dignity of hard work, but witnessing Ethan's arrogance firsthand made his stomach churn. "Frank, are you okay?" whispered Emily, stepping beside him. He offered her a tired smile. "I've been through worse, dear, but thank you for asking." Emily shook her head in frustration. "Ethan treats everyone like garbage. If he knew who you really were..." She stopped herself. Frank chuckled. "That's the point of this little test, isn't it?" Emily was one of the few people who had ever shown Frank kindness. She had no idea he was the owner, but unlike Ethan, she treated him with respect simply because it was the right thing to do. Before Emily could respond, Ethan's voice rang out again. "Hey, old man, you missed a spot." Frank turned to see Ethan smirking at him, while several employees snickered in the background. The way Ethan spoke to him, so condescending, so disrespectful, fueled a fire inside Frank. But he kept his cool. With a knowing look, Frank dipped his mop back into the bucket. Ethan had no idea who he was dealing with. Little did the arrogant manager know his days of power were numbered. The night dragged on, and so did Ethan's cruelty. "Move faster, old man," Ethan barked, knocking over a glass on purpose. "You missed another spot." Frank sighed, gripping his mop tightly. He had faced corporate betrayals, economic downturns, and fierce competition in his career. But this level of blatant disrespect hit differently. He had never tolerated bullying, especially not in his own establishment. As Frank bent down to clean the mess, Ethan smirked and turned to the other staff. "You see this, guys? If you don't work hard in life, this is what you become," Ethan scoffed, nudging a few younger employees. "A wrinkled old janitor, mopping floors for people like me." The room fell silent. Even the employees who usually laughed at Ethan's jokes seemed uncomfortable. A few exchanged glances, sensing that the manager had gone too far this time. Frank slowly stood up, wiping his hands on his uniform. He stared at Ethan with an intensity that made the younger man shift uncomfortably. "You know, Ethan," Frank said in a low, calm voice, "you should be careful how you treat people. You never know who they really are." Ethan let out a mocking laugh. "Oh, please, what are you, some secret millionaire? Give me a break." Frank gave a small, knowing smile and simply walked away. Tomorrow, everything would change. The next morning, the restaurant buzzed with its usual morning rush. Ethan strutted into the establishment, feeling powerful. He barely acknowledged the employees as he grabbed a coffee and leaned against the counter. "Another day, another dollar," he muttered. At that moment, the doors swung open. Several sharply dressed individuals walked in, all exuding authority. The staff immediately took notice. These weren't regular customers. Leading the group was a distinguished-looking man in a tailored suit, accompanied by 2 assistants and a lawyer. They walked with purpose, their eyes scanning the restaurant. Ethan, seeing an opportunity to impress, straightened his tie and rushed over. "Good morning, gentlemen. Welcome to my restaurant." He extended his hand confidently. The man in the suit raised an eyebrow, but didn't shake Ethan's hand. Instead, he glanced at one of his assistants. "Is he the manager?" The assistant nodded. Ethan, sensing something was off, forced a laugh. Who exactly are you?" The man's expression remained unreadable. Then Frank emerged from the kitchen. But this time, he wasn't in his janitor's uniform. He wore a sleek navy blue suit, polished shoes, and a confident demeanor that made the entire room go silent. Ethan's face twisted in confusion. What's going on?" Frank took slow, deliberate steps forward, his eyes locked on Ethan. You asked me yesterday if I was a secret millionaire. He stopped just a foot away from Ethan, then smirked. You weren't far off. Ethan swallowed hard. Whoa, what? Frank turned to the well-dressed man beside him. Ethan, meet Richard Collins, my legal advisor. Then he motioned to the assistants. And my corporate team. The entire restaurant staff gasped. Ethan paled. This has to be some kind of joke. But Frank wasn't smiling anymore. This was just the beginning. Ethan's confidence wavered as murmurs filled the restaurant. The employees exchanged stunned glances, whispering amongst themselves. Frank took a step closer, his once hunched posture now replaced with authority. I'm Frank Dawson, he said, his voice steady and commanding. Owner and founder of this restaurant chain. Ethan's face drained of color. That's not possible, he stammered. Oh, but it is, Frank continued, pulling out a sleek business card and handing it to Ethan. For the past month, I've been working here undercover to see how my employees are treated when they have no power, no title. His eyes darkened, and what I saw was appalling. Ethan's hands shook as he read the card. Frank Dawson, CEO, Dawson's Dining Group. The restaurant staff stood in shock, staring at the man they had known as the old janitor. Mr. Dawson, Linda, one of the waitresses, gasped. You own this place? Frank gave her a small smile. That's right, Linda, and I've been watching. He turned his gaze back to Ethan, whose breathing had become erratic. Ethan let out a nervous chuckle, straightening his tie. Oh, okay, listen. Maybe I was a little harsh, but Frank raised a hand, silencing him. You were more than harsh, Ethan. You humiliated, insulted, and degraded an employee just because you thought he was beneath you. His tone was sharp, unforgiving. That's not leadership. That's abuse of power. Ethan swallowed hard. Please, Mr. Dawson. Frank turned to his legal team. Effective immediately, Ethan's employment is terminated. The entire staff gasped. Ethan's eyes widened in horror. You can't do this! Frank's expression was unwavering. Actually, I can. He glanced at Richard, his lawyer, who pulled out a prepared document. And I already have. Ethan stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The weight of Frank's words crashed down on him. This is a mistake, he blurted out, desperation creeping into his voice. Mr. Dawson, please, let's talk about this. I didn't know who you were. Frank's gaze was sharp. And that's the problem, Ethan. You only respect people when they have power. That's not how a true leader operates. The restaurant was eerily silent, every employee watching as the arrogant manager crumbled before them. Linda, the waitress, exchanged a knowing look with the head chef. Frank turned to the staff. I want everyone here to know this restaurant thrives because of you. Not because of managers like Ethan who abuse their authority, but because of the hard-working people who show up every day and give their best. A ripple of relief spread across the team. The janitors, the waiters, the cooks, everyone who had suffered under Ethan's reign felt vindicated. Ethan, meanwhile, was in full panic mode. Please, I need this job, he pleaded. I have a family to support. Frank studied him for a moment, then sighed. You had the power to treat people with kindness, Ethan, but you chose arrogance. He turned to Richard, his lawyer. Ensure his severance is processed properly. Ethan's shoulders sagged in defeat. His pride had cost him everything. As security escorted him out, the staff finally exhaled. Then Frank did something unexpected. He grabbed a mop. Everyone watched in shock as their billionaire boss started cleaning. We work together, Frank said with a grin. No job is beneath anyone. The staff erupted into applause. In that moment, they realized their boss wasn't just a wealthy man in a suit. He was one of them. The restaurant buzzed with a renewed sense of energy. Employees who had spent years walking on eggshells under Ethan's reign now felt an unfamiliar yet welcome feeling. Hope. Frank, still gripping the mop, gave the floor one final swipe before handing it over to a nearby janitor with a warm smile. You do this better than me, he chuckled. I think I'll stick to running the business. A round of laughter spread through the staff, breaking the lingering tension of the night. Linda, the waitress who had witnessed it all, stepped forward. Mr. Dawson, I just want to say, We've never had a boss who actually cared about us before. Frank's expression softened. That changes today. He turned to the entire team. Starting now, no one in this restaurant will feel undervalued. I built this business from the ground up, and I won't let people like Ethan poison it with their arrogance. Every single one of you matters. Murmurs of excitement and relief echoed through the restaurant. Employees exchanged hopeful glances, unable to believe the transformation happening before their eyes. Then Frank dropped another bombshell. I'm raising wages across the board. Gasps filled the room. Linda's hand flew to her mouth. One of the janitors, a man in his late 50s, actually teared up. Frank continued, his voice strong and determined. And not just that, I'm introducing full benefits for everyone. Healthcare, paid time off, and bonuses for hard work. The room erupted into cheers. Some clapped, others hugged each other in disbelief. The once tense and oppressive workplace was now filled with joy. Linda, still in shock, finally spoke. But why are you doing this? Frank smiled. Because I know what it's like to be in your shoes. I was a janitor once. I worked the late shifts, got yelled at, and was overlooked. No one should have to experience that, especially not in a business I own. The entire staff was moved. For the first time in years, they felt valued. Then the head chef spoke up. What about Ethan? Frank's smile faded slightly. He'll get what's fair, he said, but I can't run a business with people who treat others like dirt. He made his choice. No one objected. They had seen firsthand what kind of man Ethan was. Frank took a deep breath, looking around at the people who made his business thrive. This isn't just a restaurant, it's a family, and starting today, I'll make sure it's treated like one. The employees cheered once more, their voices echoing through the restaurant. For the first time in years, they weren't just workers in a job, they were part of something greater. And as Frank Dawson looked around, he knew he had done the right thing.